May 8, 1945. Whitehall. Winston Churchill stood on the balcony of the Ministry of Health, facing a city in celebration. The war in Europe was over. London was shouting itself hoarse. The cameras captured the raised hand, the familiar V for victory, the image that would define the end of the conflict for Britain. Inside the government, the war had not ended. Only days earlier, in a closed room away from the crowds, Churchill had issued a directive that cut against every public signal of unity and relief. He summoned Britain's senior military leadership and gave them an order that left no room for interpretation. They were to prepare a full-scale offensive against the Soviet Union. Not a theoretical study, not a defensive contingency, an actual operational plan for war. The objective was explicit. The Red Army was to be forced back from Central and Eastern Europe. The Soviet government was to be compelled to honor its promises regarding Poland and the political future of territories already under Soviet occupation. The start date was fixed, July 1st, 1945. The instructions stunned the Joint Planning Staff. Germany had not yet fully ceased fighting. Allied forces were still clearing pockets of resistance. Europe was wrecked, supply lines were stretched, and armies were physically exhausted after nearly 6 years of continuous war. None of that altered the order. Churchill demanded a plan for immediate offensive action against the largest land force on Earth. The language he used mattered. He did not ask whether such a war was advisable. He did not ask what the political consequences might be. He did not frame the task as preparation for negotiations. He told his planners to assume war and work backward from that assumption. Churchill's distrust of the Soviet Union was not improvised in May 1945. It had hardened over the course of the war, reinforced by conferences where he watched concessions accumulate and by intelligence reports that mapped the steady expansion of Soviet control. With Franklin Roosevelt dead and the American presidency newly occupied, Churchill believed the strategic environment was about to shift. If Britain intended to act, it would have to act quickly before diplomatic realities became fixed. The planners were professionals. They did not argue. They began calculating force ratios, supply requirements, and possible axes of advance. They did so knowing that the numbers would not favor them and that the political consequences of success or failure were incalculable. The decision had been made. It was made in a command room, not on a battlefield. Outside, the public celebrated peace. Inside, Britain quietly committed itself to the possibility of another war. Operation Unthinkable now existed, on paper and under seal, waiting for an answer that military logic would soon provide. By early May 1945, the military situation in Europe could be reduced to numbers, distances, and fatigue. Stripped of politics, stripped of intention, the balance of force was brutally clear. The Red Army dominated the continent. In the Western Soviet theater alone, it fielded roughly 7 million men organized into more than 170 divisions. These forces were not garrison troops. They were combat-hardened formations that had advanced from Stalingrad to Berlin, absorbing losses that would have broken any other army and still retaining offensive capacity. Their tank fleets were larger than those of Britain and the United States combined. Their artillery concentrations were unmatched. Their air forces, though less refined than Western counterparts, operated in overwhelming numbers and with growing confidence. Opposing them, the Western Allies could muster approximately 4 million troops in Europe, spread across 47 divisions. Many of these units were already being earmarked for redeployment to the Pacific. Others were under strength, depleted by months of continuous combat since Normandy. Equipment was worn. Vehicles required maintenance. Ammunition stocks were sufficient for ongoing operations, not for a new continental war. On paper, the disparity alone suggested inevitability. Any broad-front assault against the Red Army would be annihilated. Allied planners understood this immediately, but planning was not about inevitability. It was about identifying margins, however narrow, where force could still be applied. Those margins existed, but only in theory. The first was timing. Soviet forces were deployed across an enormous frontage stretching from the Baltic to the Balkans. Their logistics were strained by distance and destruction. Rail lines were damaged. Roads were primitive. Supply depots lagged behind advancing formations. A sudden Western attack, launched before Soviet consolidation, might achieve localized surprise and temporary disruption. The second margin was concentration. While the Soviets enjoyed overwhelming overall superiority, their strength was unevenly distributed. Allied forces, if concentrated along a narrow axis, could potentially achieve temporary local parity or even superiority. This would not win a war, but it could force political negotiation if Soviet advances were checked early and visibly. Air power offered another limited advantage. The Western Allies retained superior coordination between air and ground forces. Their reconnaissance capabilities were unmatched. In a short, violent opening phase, Allied air forces could interdict Soviet movements, disrupt command nodes, and slow reinforcements. This advantage would erode quickly, but it existed at the outset. Terrain also mattered. Central Europe's rivers, the Elbe, the Oder, their tributaries, formed natural barriers. If seized or crossed decisively, they could anchor a defensive line behind an initial offensive thrust. The planners did not imagine sweeping advances. They imagined forcing pauses, creating friction, buying leverage. Then there was the most controversial factor of all. Millions of German soldiers were now prisoners in Allied hands. Among them were experienced officers and men who had fought the Red Army for 4 years. They understood Soviet tactics, strengths, and habits. Their knowledge was current. Their discipline remained intact. Allied planners noted, without sentiment, that these formations represented the only available manpower pool capable of rapidly augmenting Western strength. Rearming even a fraction of these troops would not equalize the balance, but it could narrow it enough, in specific sectors, to prevent immediate collapse. This was not seen as a path to victory. It was seen as a way to avoid instant defeat. Every opportunity identified by the planners shared the same flaw. It depended on flawless execution under impossible conditions. Speed had to be absolute. Coordination had to be perfect. Political cohesion had to hold. There could be no delay, no hesitation, no public exposure. The opportunity was real only in the narrowest technical sense. It existed on maps, in tables, and in assumptions stacked precariously atop one another. It did not exist in depth, in resilience, or in margin for error. The window for action was measured in weeks. Not months, not seasons. Weeks. Once the Red Army consolidated, rotated forces, and stabilized logistics, even theoretical opportunity would vanish. This was the military reality behind Churchill's order. There was no illusion of triumph. There was only the possibility, faint, fleeting, that force might still shape the political outcome before mathematics rendered resistance meaningless. Churchill's assessment in early May 1945 was neither impulsive nor theatrical. It was the product of accumulation. Years of conferences, cables, intelligence summaries, and personal observation had led him to a conclusion he considered unavoidable. He believed the Soviet Union was not transitioning from wartime ally to peacetime partner. It was transitioning from beneficiary to occupier. The evidence, as he saw it, was already visible. Red Army formations were not withdrawing after liberation. They were entrenching. Provisional governments across Eastern Europe were being shaped under Soviet supervision. Political pluralism existed only on paper. Poland, whose defense had justified Britain's entry into the war, was no longer sovereign in any meaningful sense. Each development reinforced the same pattern. Churchill did not need persuasion from his intelligence chiefs. He had been warning about totalitarian expansion since the 1930s, often in isolation. What troubled him now was not merely Soviet strength, but Western passivity. At Tehran and Yalta, he had watched concessions accumulate while assurances substituted for enforcement. He recorded privately that promises without leverage were meaningless. By May 1945, leverage was disappearing by the day. The death of Franklin Roosevelt altered the equation. Harry Truman was untested, his foreign policy undefined. Churchill interpreted this as both risk and opportunity. American policy might harden against Soviet ambitions, but it might also retreat into exhaustion and demobilization. Britain could not assume American resolve. It could only act while American forces were still in place. When Churchill convened the Joint Planning Staff, he did so with this context already settled in his mind. He did not ask them to confirm his fears. He asked them to prepare for their consequences. His directive was explicit in both scope and intent. The planners were to assume war with the Soviet Union beginning in the summer of 1945. They were to identify how such a war could be fought, even if the answer was unfavorable. He insisted on dates, force compositions, and objectives. Abstraction was unacceptable. Churchill's credibility with his chiefs rested on preparation, not rhetoric. He arrived armed with figures, deployment maps, and political assumptions. He acknowledged Soviet numerical superiority openly. He did not dispute it. Instead, he pressed the planners to identify compensating factors, however limited. One such factor he raised himself, before they could dismiss the problem entirely: German manpower. Churchill understood the moral revulsion this proposal would provoke. He also understood the arithmetic. The Western Allies did not possess sufficient infantry strength to contest the Red Army across Central Europe. There was no industrial or demographic remedy available within the required time frame. Only one reservoir of trained soldiers existed on the continent, and it had just surrendered. These men had fought the Red Army at enormous cost. They understood its doctrine, its command habits, its vulnerabilities. Their equipment was familiar. Their formations, though defeated, were not disintegrated in the same way as earlier Axis collapses. Churchill did not romanticize them. He treated them as assets, nothing more. He instructed planners to consider rearming selected German units under strict Allied control. Not advisors, not auxiliaries, combat formations. This proposal was not presented as ideal. It was presented as necessary. Churchill also anticipated objections regarding logistics, morale, and reliability. He acknowledged them without concession. No option, he argued, was free of risk. The absence of options was itself the risk. What distinguished Churchill's preparation was his willingness to follow the logic of his own premises to their conclusion. If Soviet expansion posed an existential threat to Britain's post-war position, then measures previously considered unthinkable had to be examined. He did not argue for them publicly. He did not even argue for them politically. He demanded that they be evaluated militarily. In doing so, he forced the Joint Planning Staff into an uncomfortable position. They could no longer dismiss the concept on ethical grounds alone. They had to demonstrate, with data and analysis, whether even this extreme approach altered the strategic balance. Churchill's foresight lay not in predicting victory. It lay in predicting consolidation. He believed that once Soviet control hardened, no military option would remain. Planning now, even for a war that might never be fought, preserved clarity. Failure to plan ensured paralysis. He did not seek consensus. He sought preparedness. By the time the planners began their assessments in earnest, they understood that the Prime Minister was not posturing. He was preparing for a future he believed was already unfolding. Whether his conclusions were correct was a separate matter. What could not be doubted was the seriousness with which he approached them. This was not bravado. It was anticipation carried to its logical end. The resistance to Churchill's directive did not arrive as open defiance. It emerged through procedure, caution, and institutional gravity. The Joint Planning Staff did not argue with the Prime Minister's authority. They responded by doing what bureaucracies do when confronted with an order that defies structural reality. They tested it until its weaknesses became undeniable. The first barrier was numerical, and it was impossible to obscure. Soviet superiority was not marginal. It was decisive. The Red Army outnumbered Western forces in manpower, armor, artillery, and operational depth. Even optimistic Allied estimates showed no scenario in which an initial Western offensive did not provoke a massive Soviet counterstroke. The planners emphasized this not as opinion, but as arithmetic. The second barrier was exhaustion. Allied armies had fought continuously since Normandy. Units were under strength. Commanders were preparing for redeployment or demobilization. Equipment was worn down by months of pursuit warfare across France and Germany. Morale was high because victory was near, but stamina was not. Launching a new war would mean reversing every expectation soldiers had been given about going home. Logistics followed. The Allied supply system had been built to move west to east, in pursuit of a collapsing enemy. A war against the Soviets would require immediate reorientation under conditions of destroyed infrastructure and contested lines of communication. Fuel, ammunition, and replacement flows were adequate for occupation duties, not sustained high-intensity combat against a peer force. None of this, however, was sufficient to halt planning. Military logic alone rarely stops political intent. What began to impose limits was alliance structure. Britain could not act alone. Any offensive against the Soviet Union would require American participation at every level. Yet the United States had not been consulted before Churchill issued his directive. American leadership was in transition. Truman's administration was still absorbing inherited commitments. There was no guarantee that Washington would accept a British-initiated war plan, especially one that contradicted months of public messaging about Allied unity. Planners understood that even drafting such a plan risked exposure. If the Soviets learned that Britain was preparing for an attack, the political consequences could be immediate and severe. Trust would collapse. Occupation arrangements in Germany could disintegrate overnight. A preventive war might be triggered by the act of planning itself. The most volatile element was Churchill's proposal to rearm German soldiers. From a purely military perspective, the logic was comprehensible. From every other perspective, it was explosive. Britain had fought a 6-year war defined by the destruction of Nazi Germany. The British public had been conditioned to see German militarism as an existential threat. The idea of restoring German units, even under Allied command, risked moral outrage and political crisis. Planners also doubted feasibility. German prisoners were disarmed, dispersed, and psychologically defeated. Reconstituting formations would take time the plan did not allow. Loyalty could not be assumed. Control could not be guaranteed. A single breakdown could compromise Allied positions and validate Soviet accusations of Western bad faith. American reaction was an additional constraint. The United States had suffered immense casualties fighting German forces. The prospect of rearming former enemies so soon after victory would provoke resistance from Congress, the press, and the public. Any operation dependent on German manpower risked immediate American withdrawal of support. Institutional memory reinforced caution. Allied command had already been strained by disputes over strategy, personality, and prestige. Senior officers remembered how close the alliance had come to fracture during previous crises. They understood that unity was not automatic. It had to be preserved deliberately, sometimes at the expense of military optimality. As these concerns accumulated, the planners' assessments grew increasingly conditional. They framed every offensive scenario with caveats, assumptions, and warnings. Success depended on Soviet unpreparedness, on American commitment, on German compliance, on secrecy, on speed, on political consensus that did not yet exist. The mechanism of overrule was not a single decision. It was attrition. Churchill continued to press. He emphasized urgency. He warned that delay favored the Soviets. He argued that the occupation of Eastern Europe would soon become irreversible. But he also absorbed the planners' conclusions. He did not dispute their projections of failure. He did not deny the risks they identified. Instead, he adjusted his demand. He asked for defensive plans alongside offensive ones. This was not a retreat, but it was an acknowledgement. If Britain could not force the Soviets back, it would at least need to prepare for the possibility of Soviet advance. Planning for defense allowed the same assessments to be preserved without committing the government to action. It kept options open while deferring decision. Institutional caution had achieved its effect without open confrontation. The planners had not refused the prime minister. They had complied in a way that made execution politically and militarily untenable. By late May, the momentum behind Operation Unthinkable had slowed. The plan existed. It was detailed. It was alarming. but it was encased in reservations that no responsible government could ignore. The alliance framework, the moral constraints, and the sheer scale of risk combined to impose limits Churchill could not bypass alone. The overrule did not come as an order rescinded. It came as an operation deferred, diluted, and ultimately contained within classified files. The system had absorbed the shock and neutralized it. The consequences of the decision never unfolded in gunfire, but they were no less real for remaining confined to paper. Every estimate produced by the Joint Planning Staff translated political intent into projected loss, and every projection traced its origin back to the order issued in early May. The planners' conclusions were consistent and severe. A Western offensive against the Red Army would almost certainly fail. Even under the most favorable assumptions, Allied forces would be unable to sustain momentum beyond the opening phase. Soviet reserves were deep, mobile, and positioned to respond. An initial Western thrust, even if tactically successful, would trigger a counteroffensive of overwhelming scale. This was not conjecture. It was calculation. The Red Army's numerical superiority meant that any breach could be sealed quickly. Any Allied penetration would become a salient, exposed on multiple axes. Once Soviet armor and artillery concentrations were redirected, Western forces would face encirclement rather than breakthrough. The planners warned that defeat would not be contained to Central Europe. A failed offensive could open the door to a Soviet advance westward, potentially beyond Germany, into the Low Countries and toward the Channel ports. Britain itself was not immune in these projections. The planners acknowledged, quietly but explicitly, that the British Isles could not be defended indefinitely if the Red Army reached the Atlantic coast. Naval superiority offered protection, but not invulnerability. Strategic bombing had not broken Germany. It would not stop a continental army already in possession of Europe's industrial base. Churchill did not contest these conclusions. He absorbed them. The risks attached to German rearmament amplified every danger. German units might provide manpower, but they introduced instability. Their integration would require rapid retraining, re-equipping, and command restructuring. None of this could be done invisibly. Soviet intelligence would detect it. The narrative would be uncontrollable. A British-led war fought with former German soldiers would be portrayed as a revival of German militarism under Western sponsorship. The political consequences would be immediate. Allied moral authority, already strained by post-war realities, would collapse in occupied Europe. Governments in exile, resistance movements, and civilian populations would be forced to reevaluate the meaning of liberation. The legitimacy of the entire Western occupation could fracture. Loyalty was another unresolved variable. German soldiers might fight the Red Army, but their motivations were uncertain. Some might comply out of anti-Soviet hatred. Others might resist re-entry into combat. Discipline could not be assumed. A single failure could cascade across an operation already operating without margin. Timing compounded the danger. The proposed start date of July 1st left weeks, not months, for preparation. Logistics would be rushed. Training would be abbreviated. Coordination would be improvised. There was no buffer for weather, mechanical failure, or command friction. A modern war launched under such constraints demanded perfection that history did not support. As these consequences were documented, the tone of planning shifted. Offensive options were still outlined, but increasingly paired with defensive assessments. What would happen if the Soviets struck first? How far could Allied forces withdraw before stabilizing? Where could defensible lines be drawn? How long could Western Europe be held? These questions reflected a change in emphasis. The planners were no longer exploring how to compel Soviet compliance. They were exploring how to survive Soviet reaction. Churchill responded by authorizing these defensive studies without abandoning the offensive file. This dual-track approach allowed him to preserve strategic leverage while acknowledging operational reality. It also ensured that the consequences of inaction were documented as thoroughly as the consequences of action. Meanwhile, political events accelerated. British public attention was turning inward. The war had ended. Elections loomed. Demobilization was no longer abstract. Soldiers wanted to return home. Families expected peace dividends, not new casualty lists. There was no political capital available for another war, especially one that could not be framed as defensive. American signals were equally decisive. The United States was focused on Japan. Resources were being redirected across the Pacific. Any European war not directly tied to American security would face immediate resistance. Without full American commitment, Operation Unthinkable was impossible. With it, escalation would be global. The ultimate consequence of Churchill's order was therefore containment. The plan was completed. It was written. It was reviewed. It was classified. And it was set aside. Churchill lost the general election in July 1945. His government fell before any decision could be revisited at the political level. The incoming administration inherited files, not commitments. Operation Unthinkable remained a staff exercise without executive momentum. No order to execute was ever issued. Yet the absence of action did not mean the absence of effect. The planning process itself hardened assumptions. It forced Britain's military leadership to confront the reality of Soviet power without illusions. It confirmed that Eastern Europe could not be reclaimed by force without unacceptable risk. It clarified that the wartime alliance could not be preserved through coercion. The consequence was strategic resignation. As Soviet control consolidated across Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, Britain lacked both means and mandate to intervene. The line was drawn not by agreement, but by capability. The world that emerged was shaped by decisions not taken as much as by those that were. Operation Unthinkable did not produce a battlefield. It produced a boundary. The confrontation it represented occurred through memoranda, estimates, and political transitions. It established the limits of post-war Western power at the very moment victory suggested boundless influence. It demonstrated that foresight without feasibility leads not to action, but to accommodation. The bloodshed it might have caused was avoided. The geopolitical consequences it sought to prevent were not. In that sense, the operation achieved neither its stated objective nor its worst fear. It did not trigger a Third World War. It did not halt Soviet expansion. It confirmed, instead, that the leverage of arms had already passed. The consequences of Churchill's decision were therefore indirect but permanent. A war was planned and not fought. A warning was issued and not acted upon. A boundary was acknowledged, and history moved forward constrained by it. The battlefield never appeared. The outcome did. The post-war record stripped Operation Unthinkable of speculation and replaced it with documentation. When British archives were opened decades later, the plan emerged intact, not as rumor or exaggeration, but as a formal product of government direction. The files confirmed what had long been denied. In May 1945, Britain's military staff had been ordered to prepare for war against the Soviet Union. The memoranda were precise. They named dates. They specified force ratios. They evaluated axes of advance. They discussed German manpower explicitly. There was no ambiguity about intent. This was not an academic exercise. It was contingency planning initiated by the Prime Minister himself. The assessments preserved in those documents validated the judgments reached at the time. Every post-war review by professional historians reached the same conclusion as the Joint Planning Staff. A Western offensive would have failed. The Red Army's numerical and positional advantages were overwhelming. Even optimistic scenarios ended in exhaustion, encirclement, or strategic collapse. What the documents also revealed was restraint. Churchill did not suppress unfavorable analysis. He did not demand revisions to make success appear plausible. The most pessimistic estimates were retained, circulated, and filed. The planning process recorded its own negation. The decision not to act was therefore not the product of ignorance uncovered later. It was the product of knowledge available immediately. Politically, the file showed how fragile Churchill's position had already become. Britain in 1945 was exhausted economically, demographically, and psychologically. The electorate that removed him from office weeks later was not inclined toward new wars or imperial enforcement. The post-war government inherited a country focused on reconstruction, not confrontation. American records reinforced this reality. The United States was pivoting toward the Pacific and demobilization. There was no appetite for another continental war, particularly one initiated without provocation. Any British attempt to proceed alone would have collapsed immediately. Any attempt to proceed jointly would have fractured American domestic consensus. The Cold War that followed unfolded along lines eerily consistent with Churchill's fears, but not with his proposed remedy. Eastern Europe did fall under Soviet domination. Poland did not regain independence. Agreements reached during wartime conferences were interpreted unilaterally by Moscow. The balance of power hardened into blocs. Yet the post-war record also demonstrated that military force in 1945 would not have altered that outcome favorably. Nuclear weapons soon redefined strategic calculus. Economic reconstruction reshaped Western strength. Political institutions replaced armies as the primary instruments of competition. The confrontation Churchill anticipated arrived, but not in the form he imagined. Operation Unthinkable survived as evidence of a transitional moment. It captured the instant when wartime momentum collided with post-war reality. Britain still possessed global habits of command, but no longer possessed the material capacity to enforce them alone. The files documented that mismatch with clinical clarity. In retrospect, the operation's greatest significance lay not in what it proposed, but in what it revealed. It exposed the limits of victory. It demonstrated that defeating Germany did not confer dominance over Europe's future. It showed that alliance, once dissolved, could not be replaced by force without catastrophic risk. The post-war record closed the case without drama. There were no cover-ups undone by revelation. There were no suppressed alternatives that might have changed history. The plan was real. The danger was real. The restraint was real. Operation Unthinkable did not fail because it was abandoned. It failed because it was examined honestly. That examination survived its author. It remained on file, waiting decades to be read, until time removed the need for secrecy and left only judgment. The record speaks clearly. The war that was planned could not be won. The war that followed was fought by other means. The final judgment on Operation Unthinkable is not complicated by ambiguity. The record is complete. The evidence is sufficient. The decision was real. It was issued deliberately by the British Prime Minister in May 1945. It ordered preparation for war against the Soviet Union while the ink on victory declarations was still drying. It was driven by political calculation, not battlefield necessity. It was conceived in a command room, not under fire. The assessment that followed was equally clear. Militarily, the plan was unsound. The Red Army's superiority was decisive. Allied forces were exhausted, numerically inferior, and logistically unprepared. The proposal to rearm German soldiers introduced risks that exceeded any potential gain. No credible path to success existed. Institutional restraint prevented catastrophe. Professional planners did not defy authority. They documented reality. Alliance politics, public exhaustion, and American disengagement imposed limits that Churchill could not override. The system absorbed the impulse and neutralized it. Churchill's strategic instinct was not imaginary. Soviet expansion did occur. Eastern Europe was lost to Western influence for decades. His warning proved accurate. His method did not. Force could not reverse that outcome in 1945. It could only accelerate disaster. The plan, once examined honestly, collapsed under its own assumptions. It was not rejected because it was immoral. It was rejected because it was unworkable. Operation Unthinkable, therefore, stands as a closed case. A war was planned and deliberately not fought. The absence of action prevented immediate bloodshed, but did not prevent geopolitical division. The limits of British power were exposed at the moment of victory. This was not a failure of courage. It was a confrontation with reality. The file was sealed. The decision passed. History moved forward along lines that no late offensive could have altered. The case is closed. If you want more investigations into decisions made far from the battlefield, decisions that shaped the world without firing a shot, subscribe to the channel. If there's another sealed file you want opened, leave a comment.